Now tonight, I was praying about, okay, what should I preach? What message would the Lord have me? And I was struck by your banners here. And Pastor Henry informed me that this is not a yearly thing. This is the theme for your church, about knowing Christ, loving Christ, and living for him. And so I want us to turn to Luke chapter 14. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus goes to the house of an important Pharisee. It doesn't tell us who it is, it just says a chief Pharisee, an important Pharisee. And he has some discussions with them. Because as you are probably well aware, the Pharisees were religious leaders of the Jews. They thought that they followed God better than everyone else, and everyone should listen to them. I mean, this is putting it simply, and follow what the Pharisees did so they could also be followers of God. They thought they did it better. So Jesus, in this passage, challenges them on their discipleship, their following Christ. But the questions that I'm going to pull from there and ask them, to have them check and say, okay, are they good disciples of God? We can ask ourselves and say, okay, yes, that is your church's theme. That really should be the theme of all of our life. Do we know Christ? Do we love him? Do we live for him? So these questions will help evaluate us as disciples of Christ. Are we truly Christ's disciples? And so with that in mind, let's start reading in verse 1, Luke chapter 14 and verse 1. And it came to pass, as Jesus, went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. Behold, there was a certain man before him, which had the dropsy. And Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And they held their peace. And he took him and healed him and let him go, and answered them, saying, Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him again to these things. So here we see the first section. Jesus starts, and he goes in, and all the Pharisees are watching him, and the lawyers, the experts in the law. Have you ever been somewhere where people are watching you, and you feel like, is there something on me? Maybe Jesus was feeling like that. No, Jesus knew their thoughts, but they were watching him, and they knew that this man with the dropsy, the sick man, was there. And they were watching and say, okay, what's Jesus going to do? Because did you notice what day this was? This was the Sabbath day. And on the Sabbath day, they had made a rule saying you were not allowed to work. And since Jesus every day was healing people, that was his job. So for Jesus to heal someone on the Sabbath day was Jesus' work. Okay, but then Jesus brings out an interesting point. He says, okay, which of you, back then, they didn't have cars, they had animals. You needed animals for your work. You needed animals to get places. Which of you, having a donkey or a cow, an ox, and if that falls into a ditch, are you just going to leave them there in the ditch all Sabbath? And obviously the expected answer is, of course not. So really, when I read this, here's the question that I come up with that I can then ask myself, and you can ask yourself, is when it comes to following God, whose will am I concerned with doing? Because here, do you think those Pharisees cared about that man with the dropsy? They didn't care whether he got healed or not. That wasn't the point. They wanted to catch Jesus doing something wrong because Jesus was making them look bad. Jesus served God, obviously because he was God. We know that. But the Pharisees, they said they served God, but they didn't look like Jesus. They were constantly almost feeling like they were in competition with Jesus. As you read through the Gospels, you see the Pharisees constantly trying to set traps for Jesus because they wanted Jesus to look bad. So here again, we have a man with a dropsy, and they didn't care about him. They wanted to say, okay, Jesus, what is Jesus going to do with this guy? Because you know what? If he heals on the Sabbath day, he worked, he broke the law, everyone will see Jesus is not a good Jew. But Jesus turns it right around and says, wait a minute, if you have an animal and they get stuck in a hole,
are you just going to leave them there? Even on the Sabbath day? And the answer is, of course not. You would do whatever it took to get that one out. So really, Jesus is asking, okay, who are you concerned with pleasing? Whose will are you concerned with doing? When it comes to us in church, do we love him? Are we concerned with what Jesus wants us to do? Now, I don't know what Jesus wants you to do, other than what the Bible says. But he has a specific plan for each one of us. His plan for me is to not live in Fostoria, but to live in Nakuru, Kenya. His plan for you is to be here. But what does he want you to do? What does he want me to do? And am I so in love with Jesus and so concerned with being his disciple that I am willing to do whatever it takes to please him? Or am I concerned with what I think I look like? What makes me look good? And that's what the Pharisees were. They kind of had two questions going on there. The next set of verses 7 to verse 14. And he put forth a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out the chief rooms, saying unto them, When thou art bidden of any man to a wedding, sit not down in the highest room, lest a more honorable man than thou be bidden of him. And he that bade thee, and him come and say unto thee, Give this man place, and thou begin with shame to take the lowest room. But when thou art bidden, go and sit down in the lowest room, that when he that bade thee cometh, he may say unto thee, Friend, go up higher. Then shalt thou have worship in the presence of them that sit at meat with thee. For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. So let's take a break for just a moment there. Do you get the picture here? He said, okay, at a wedding. And okay, let me change it now, because I've saw some of this kind of fun things in Kenya. Every year when we have our Bible college, our institute, there's a pastor's meal. And there's not one head table, but there's tables that get their food first, and there's tables that don't get their food first. And it's kind of fun to watch and say, okay, who's going to come in and sit right there at that important table? And they know. And so the other missionary, not my coworker, but another one that also works with us, he came and he mixed it up and he changed the order of the food. And it was kind of funny to see who got upset. But here, don't you have something like that where it's like the Pharisees, they came in and said, you know what? I'm a Pharisee. I'm important. I'm going to sit here because I'm important. They thought a lot about themselves and didn't really care about anyone else. But Jesus says, wait a minute. If you do that, you're going to be humbled, because the master of the feast, maybe he had seats assigned. He says, no, this is the seats for this person. Go find another seat. And if he was a Baptist, people come in early for food, even in Kenya. It's the same thing. Baptists are the same. If there's food, people are going to be there. So, okay, maybe this was a good Baptist celebration, and boy, that Pharisee just lucked out because he sat where he shouldn't sat, and he had to go somewhere else. But Jesus doesn't end there, because he then turns to the master of the feast in verse 12. Then said he also to him that bade him, When thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and a recompense be made thee. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. So now he tells them, the master, okay, don't invite these people, your friends, your relatives, and all those people. Why not? Back then, and what's been interesting is even in Kenyan culture, you invite certain people over because they can do something back for you. So many times, when someone dies, funerals are huge deals in Kenya. So they will invite people to this meal, and they will ask people to give money to help pay for the funeral. I know that's not our culture, it's their culture, but it's interesting because they'll have someone and you're like, okay, I know these two people, and these two people don't have anything to do with each other, but one is rich, and so they're going to invite him on and put him on this list and invite him to come because they want something back from him. It works very much that way, and that's really what's going on here. The master of the feast, he was inviting people and not inviting other people because of what these people could do for him. And I believe, this is my personally, because the Bible doesn't really say, but in verses 1 and 2, we have an example of this. back in verse 1, and it came to pass as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day that they watched him. And notice, why is this next person at the feast? And behold, there was a certain man before him which had the dropsy. Why was that sick person there at the feast? Maybe they said, hey, you there with the dropsy, you can come to this feast and you'll get a free meal. Just help us make Jesus look bad, because he's going to come and try to heal you. And so, hey, you get a meal out of this. Why would that man be at the feast? That makes no sense unless he was there intentionally. That's my own opinion, okay? There's no Bible, so if you disagree with me, that's okay. We can still be friends. But Jesus knew he was being set up here, and Jesus really turned it around and pointed out to them that as a disciple, it is important who we think of first. The Pharisees here, they only thought of themselves. Remember the first point where they thought, okay, I'm going to do my own will. I'm going to do what makes me look good. I don't care about anyone else. Here he's saying, okay, wait, who do you think of when you go to serve, when you go to do things? Who do you think of first? So I heard the music for the choir, and that is a wonderful Christmas program. I have sung it before. It's great, and it's a great outreach. But when you go to sing and play there, just because I know I'm a musician, who do you think of? You think, okay, everyone's going to know I am a great musician. This has nothing to do with the music. Or are you thinking, wow, look at these people that are coming, that have been invited, and they get to hear the gospel. Who do you think of first? Or any other area, when you come to serve, okay, who are you thinking of first? Are you thinking of yourself, how it makes you look good? What people are going to think about you after you do something? That's really what the Pharisees, it wasn't about serving God at all. It was about themselves. So if you were there at this feast, do you think the situation would be a nice, comfortable situation, or do you feel like Jesus and the Pharisees really have made this a very tense situation? And I feel like because Jesus has started confronting the Pharisees where they are and saying, wait a minute, you say you follow God, but look at this. You don't care about anyone else. You only care about yourself. You are only thinking about yourself when you go to serve. It's just about you, not about anyone else. And so at this point, notice verse 15, because then this is the way it makes sense to me. Verse 15 says, and when one of them sat at meat with him, heard these things, verses 1 to 14, he said unto him, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Have you ever wondered why that verse is there? Because it really doesn't fit verses 1 to 14. So this is my mind working, okay? Here's what I think. This Pharisee is saying, you know what? We have been found out. And so we need to keep face and keep everyone thinking we are spiritual. And so this is something that this Pharisee maybe always does. He says, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of heaven. It says a spiritual comment that has nothing to do with anything, but it kind of gets people's attention off of what Jesus had just been saying, right? And here this Pharisee is saying, wait a minute, okay, let's turn the phase and let's look at something else. But Jesus does not stop there. He actually gives another parable. In this parable, Jesus gives several different aspects. Verse 16, then said he unto him, a certain man made a great supper and bade many, and sent his servants at supper time to say to them that were bidden, come, for all things are now ready. And they began with one consent to make excuse. And the first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee, have me excused. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee, have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So here, those people right there, that is the Pharisees. And so Jesus is showing them, wait a minute, at that time, they didn't have refrigerators. You had to know what time the feast was so you could be there when the food was ready. So the master of the feast invited these people. These people promised to come, otherwise you would waste food. And then he says, okay, the food's ready. It's on the table. Come. The first guy says, wait a minute, I bought a piece of ground, and now I have to go look at it. Now, I've never bought a piece of ground, but if I was going to buy a piece of ground, I would look at it first. But that's me. Obviously, he didn't. But he didn't plan to go to the feast, did he? He already had an excuse for whatever reason, he didn't want to come to the feast. So he just made something up. 5 yoke of oxen, the next guy. Okay, now I need to go try these 5 yoke of oxen. Now I have bought a car, and I try that car before I buy it. But obviously this guy, he just bought 5 pairs of cows. Expensive. And he didn't even try them out. It seems a little fishy. And then the third guy, he says, oh, okay, I married a wife, and I can't come. And according to Jewish culture, he had to stay home with his wife and not go to war, not go out for 1 year. Seems like maybe that one's more legitimate, right? Except for for those of you that have gotten married, did you just wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I'm going to get married today? And you went and found someone to get married, and you went to the courthouse or the church, and you got married. Did any of you do that? I didn't do that. We planned this wedding out. So if they were planning on coming to this feast, and then this guy got married, do you think that guy was really planning on coming to the feast? Probably not. If he really got married, that takes planning. That doesn't just happen. So he decided, you know what? I have better things to do. And what Jesus is pointing out is the Pharisees claimed that they were the best followers that God had. In fact, if you read some of the Pharisees' writings, they said that they would be the best followers for the Messiah. So how many Pharisees in this chapter are following the Messiah? None of them. Even though they had said, you know what, when the Messiah comes, we're going to know him, we're going to follow him, we're going to help put him on his throne. And yet all of them in this story are seeking to find fault with Jesus, to make him look bad, to discredit Jesus. And really, when it comes to our discipleship, when do we follow through on our promise to serve God? Okay, you say, okay, God, I'll serve you, just not yet. Maybe later. Okay, I have this to take care of. I have this to take care of. But in this story, you notice we did not read the whole parable. There is one other person. We have the master. We have these group of friends. But then we have one other main character, and it's the servant. So I'm going to read this story again from the beginning, and I want you to listen to the servant and tell me at the end, when did the servant follow through on obeying his master? Because that was his job. That's what he was supposed to do. He was a good follower. So I'm going to start back in verse 16 and read through that whole story, and I want you to be listening. When does that servant obey Christ? Then said he unto him, a certain man made a great supper and bade many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, come, for all things are now ready. And they began with one consent to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen. I go to prove them. I pray thee have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and showed his master these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor, and the maimed, and the halt, and the blind. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. And the Lord said unto his servant, go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say unto you that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. So when did that servant obey the master? Seemingly right away, right? 3 times. He goes out to these friends, all of them, and he comes back. He goes out into the city. Seemingly right away, the food's still on the table. It's still ready to be eaten. Then he goes out into the highways and hedges, kind of outside the city. And he does that, and I never read once where that servant complained. He was ready to serve his master right away. And then as we read along through the story, this chapter, not story, verse 25, there were great multitudes following him. Jesus turns and says unto them, and then he gives several more parables, but I want you to skip down to the very end of it, because all those have to do with discipleship, and you can read them at your own time. We just are running short on time. So I want you to go down to the very last 2 verses, 34 and 35. And this is appropriate for the time of year. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be seasoned? It is neither fit for the land nor yet for the dunghill, but men cast it out. He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. So now, we were over on the west side of Michigan, not UP, but upper Michigan this morning, and it was snowing there. And I know you all know this because you get a lot more snow here in Michigan than we get in Kenya. What do they put on the roads when it snows? Salt, right? And then when they come along and plow that road, where does the salt end up? And what does it do to the grass on the side of the ditch? It kills it all, doesn't it? It burns it, however you want to say that. I don't see anything growing there where the salt is, because that's what salt does when you try to grow it. Or yet for the dunghill, when you have the manure pile, the fertilizer, if you were to put salt in that, would that be, I know we have Brother Childs here, and there's probably other people that are farmers, if you put salt in the fertilizer, would that be good for the field? Who would do that, right? And yet, what Jesus is warning us about is as disciples of God, of Christ, salt is good. Salt creates thirst. When you have food, putting some salt on it's nice. But what if that salt doesn't enhance the flavor like it's supposed to? It's not good for anything. You can't even put it in a manure pile. You wouldn't do anything with it because it is worthless. It only kills things. That's it. It's not good for growing. It's not good for helping the taste of the food. It's worthless salt. And as disciples of Christ, if we are true disciples of Christ, we know Christ, we love him, and we live for him, we will be effective at reaching our communities for Christ, because that's what disciples do. We're that salt, creating that thirst for Christ. But if we're like the Pharisees, very easy, right? If we just kind of look at ourselves and we say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to do what I feel like God wants me to do right now instead of what I know I read in God's word. I'm just going to do my own thing. I feel like this is better. I like this guy. We're looking at ourselves. That is not a good disciple. That is a bad disciple. That is what the Pharisees did. Or if we say, you know what, I don't care about those people. It only matters what I care about, how it makes me look and how it makes me feel. That is not a good disciple. We actually will turn people away from Christ. Or we say, okay, God, anytime you call me, I'm here to serve you. And then God calls us and we say, not today, maybe later. Oh, another time, I have too much stuff. And we just give excuses to God. We don't serve him. We will turn people away from Christ. We will be like that salt. Yes, okay, salt thrown on snow is good. It melts the snow, but then it's not good for anything else after that. It's good for rusting your vehicles. It's good for killing crops. Good for killing the grass. But that's it. It kills. And if we are the disciple like these Pharisees, we will be like that salt. But if we are a disciple like this servant, you know what? He wasn't looking at his own needs. If it might have been us going out to all those people and then going out into the city and then going out into the highways and hedges, I don't know about you, but I might be tired after all that. I might say, can you send somebody else? I need a break here. That servant didn't say anything. He just did it right away. He wasn't concerned about his own will. He would say, no, the master, that's what's important. He wasn't concerned about what other people thought about him. Here he's running, going back and forth. He didn't care. He was just serving the master. It was about his service. And he served him right away. That is the good salt. He created a thirst, and people came because of that servant. All those people that were invited to the feast came because of that servant. So what kind of disciple are you tonight? What kind of disciple am I tonight? And it's so easy to be in one category, the good servant, and then to get a critical spirit and to go into the Pharisee category. But that is sin. We, especially at this time of year, people are open more at this time of year, I feel, than any other time of year to the gospel. there's an openness. Are we going to be good disciples where people come? Yes, the Christmas programs are great. I wish I could stay and hear them. I miss all the Christmas music when I'm in Kenya. But are we going to use that as good disciples to reach people in Fostoria and the surrounding areas? Or are we going to be like the Pharisee and say, no, I want people to hear me when I'm singing, or I want people to look at me when I'm doing this, or it's about me. Even though what I'm doing is good, it's about me. Discipleship is not about me. We're serving someone else. And so what kind of servant, what kind of disciple are you right now? And to me, that is the challenge that I've had to keep looking at myself, saying, am I a good disciple? Or am I an iffy disciple, my pharisaical disciple that, have you ever heard people say, I won't go to that church because that church is full of hypocrites? Well, we might be one of those. And that's true. And that's not a good excuse for not coming to church. But how we live our lives does affect it. And that's proof of it right there. So are we a Pharisee or are we this good servant?